Here we are with part 3 of the Civil War reenactment down in Yuma, Arizona, along the Colorado River. Okay, this one's going to be about Lincoln. He's going to do a whole speech with questions asked by the media.
I wonder if we can go out there. Go ahead. I got tall arms. What?
Blocking my view.
I don't care about your view.
I do. I'm gonna go underneath.
Okay, that's fine. I'm gonna get closer. I want to hear.
Wait till them Johnny Red. Oh, sorry.
I kept you single-handed.
I appreciate that. Thank you. That's single-handed. Well, there's 5 of them, and you got 5 fingers.
6 rounds in my pistol.
I guess we can stand in front of you here.
Yes, you may. How about this way so that you're not looking into the sun? Come on down. I don't want you looking into the sun.
Forward 5 miles left. Mark.
We're gonna wait for them Johnny Rebs to mosey on. They don't like defeat too well.
Don't give them no secrets.
Bandmaster, please play Dixie. It is one of my favorite tunes, and it is good for the South to know that they are free to hear it once more. Wonderful, thank you, thank you. It is 1865. A weariness of spirit engulfs this nation. Death and despair has reached nearly every household. This war has gone on much longer than anticipated. But there is hope. The Confederacy is splintering. General Sherman is marching through the Carolinas. Grant is threatening Petersburg. it appears that victory is at hand. After 4 years as a war president, could I be looking to 4 years as a peace president? A time to unite this great country again? A time for reconstruction of the South? A time for healing? Am I finally being vindicated for all of the unpopular decisions that I had to make? I hope so. Washington is overwhelmed with more visitors than they have ever seen before. There is a large number of Confederate deserters in the city roaming the streets. Southern sympathizers, realizing that defeat could be a reality, are rumored to be plotting against me. Abduction? Assassination? Could this happen? March 4th has dawned with torrential rains and gale force winds. The crowds are slowly gathering, covered in mud, but good-natured. Upwards of 40,000 are assembling for this greatly anticipated event. The military band strikes up "Hail to the Chief" as I step forward on this wood platform on the east side of the Capitol building, out past the magnificent Corinthian columns. I look out and I recognize my good friend Frederick Douglass. Up over my left shoulder, leaning against the right buttress, is that actor, John Booth, who I had seen back in November on stage at the Ford Theater. As I begin to speak, the sun breaks through the clouds, flooding the landscape with brilliant rays of light. At this second appearing to take the oath of presidential office, there is less occasion for an extended address than there was at the first. On the occasion corresponding to this, 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it, all sought to avert it. Both parties deprecated war, but none of them would make war rather than let the nation survive. But one of them would, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude of the duration which it had already attained. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any man should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. But let us judge not, that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered, and that of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue, until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it might be said. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan. to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Thank you very much. That was the second inaugural in March 4th, 1865. I got a feeling I'm not going to finish that second term. There were always rumors of my assassination. Leading up to this time in January and February, I had many dreams of crying and weeping in Washington. And I would awake and talk to my guard, Marshal Ward Hill Lamon, who was at my door. And I would say that I heard weeping in Washington. What has happened? And he said, "Have not you heard? The president has been assassinated." I had also, every once in a while, gazed into a mirror, and I would see my doppelganger standing there right next to me. And a fortune teller one time had told me that that was my death face. So I did not fear death. I felt that if someone was going to assassinate me, they're going to get away with it. There would be nothing that we could do. And if I were to fear the assassination, I wouldn't get anything done. So all the letters and telegrams and everything threatening my life, I would kind of roll them up into a string and I would put them in my desk and just carry on. Well, here we are now. Thank you very much for being here. At this time, if you happen to have any questions, we would like to entertain them. We have Lieutenant Colonel Roberts. We have my bodyguard, Marshal Ward Hill Lamon. I'd like to ask them to come up, if you don't mind. Colonel, I believe we had a victory?
We had a victory, sir. We killed all those rebel scum like the dogs that they are. Or were.
We are fellow countrymen, sir.
Well, we sent them home to their mothers, sir.
Oh, okay.
Oh, wait, they don't know who they are.
Wow, I'm sorry to ask you a question. Does anybody here happen to have a question for one of us lighthearted people up here? No questions at all from anybody? Does anybody have an idea who this gentleman to my right is?
Guy outside the door, wasn't he?
Pardon?
The guy outside the door?
He was my...
right.
Well, yeah. Who are... Step forward. Okay, I'll step back. Who are you, sir?
My name is Marshal Ward Hill Lamon. Mr. Lincoln and I were attorneys together in Illinois before he was president. Then I joined a brand new, at that time, a brand new Republican Party and campaigned for him. And he won election in 1860. He asked me to go back to Washington, D.C. with him, which I reluctantly accepted. And,
Well, how many times did I ask you?
I believe 3 times. So for 2 times I said no. Eventually he basically ordered me.
Why did you say no?
Because I didn't want to go back to Washington, D.C. I was an attorney in Illinois, so originally I had hopes that I would have received a diplomatic post. But we got back to Washington and he made me U.S. Marshal for Washington, D.C. and also his personal bodyguard. Yeah.
I got a question. You weren't a very good bodyguard.
Yes, I
Want to
was.
repeat that question?
She said you weren't a very good bodyguard. In April of 1865, after General Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox, a couple of days later, the president sent me down to Richmond to start working on reconstruction of the country. So before I left, I told him, don't go out at night because I won't be here.
Did I listen?
Did he listen? No. And he went out at night. So I was down in Richmond, Virginia by his order when he went to the theater that night.
Unbelievable.
Where were you that night?
Me?
Yeah.
What were your first words?
He was partying.
That's right. No, we would have all been near the Richmond campaign at that time, around Petersburg, Virginia. That's basically where the war ended.
Still on the battlefield.
Yep.
Still, okay.
Pretty much the only one who came back from the battlefield was General Grant and his staff. And part of his staff, General Grant's staff, was my son Robert, our eldest. He was part of General Grant's staff about the last couple of months of the campaign. And so he came back to Washington for the rejoicing of General Lee surrendering. But everybody else was still out in the battlefield. And the war really, Colonel, the war really didn't end for another couple months, correctly?
That's correct.
Yeah.
The surrender of General Lee only surrendered the Army in Northern Virginia. The war still went on another month or so. The final big battle actually happened in southern Alabama, north of Mobile.
Really?
And then they got the word that their beloved general had surrendered, so they just gave up the fight.
Good question. Anybody else?
So,
Oh, please.
I got a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So when everybody else gave up, you said, what happened to those soldiers? Were they permitted or allowed to go back to their families at that point? Did everybody
Confederate
just like,
soldiers?
Yeah.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, she'd like to know what happened to the Confederate Army after the end of the war. Most of the men were paroled. Lincoln wanted to heal the country at that point. Had enough death, enough sorrow, enough, how'd you say it earlier? Weeping widows and mothers, and so
All that stuff.
they paroled the men. They had to turn in their weapons. Most of the officers got to keep a sidearm and a horse. But other than that, he just sent them home with an oath that they would not pick up arms against the Union again.
Yeah. They had to sign an oath stating that they would not take up arms again, they could become a citizen again. And we did that for their officers also. The politicians were a little different.
Does the price of cotton and say like in London have anything to do with the Civil War?
The sale of cotton in London have anything to do with the Civil War?
Yeah, the price.
Holy moly, we could talk about that for an hour. I mean, what actually caused the Civil War in the first place? Well, we were selling, the majority of cotton that England was purchasing was from us. Cotton was king in the South. It was millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars worth cotton. And the South definitely didn't want to give that up. And for political reasons, they didn't want to give, or for material reasons, profit, they didn't want to give up slavery. So that was kind of the big crutch. If you want to blame anybody about that, you could also blame Eli Whitney. Eli Whitney had the cotton gin. What did that do? That made it easier to separate the cotton seeds from the seeds. Instead of taking all day to do one bushel, they could do 10, 15, 20 bushels in a day. That expanded cotton. So it was rather crazy in that respect, yes. So the cost of tea in China, yes. Cotton definitely was a big.
Some people are saying there are economic issues that were a lot more involved in the cause of the war than say slavery.
Were the causes of the Civil War more economical than slavery? I believe that if we had abolished slavery before, back in the founding fathers had done it, or even 20, 30 years before this time, we wouldn't have had a Civil War. Was that the cause of the Civil War? Not necessarily. But if we didn't have slavery, I don't think we would ever have had a Civil War. It was definitely economics, and that was part of it. Did we invent slavery? If you've read your Bible that I talked about, the Israelites were enslaved by the Egyptians, right? It had been around a long time. So we were just one nation of almost every nation on earth that had slaves. So, but once we had our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, that to me was the rub. Then it should have changed as soon as we had that. So I was definitely against slavery. I couldn't come right out and say that at the time, politics, but definitely it was, that to me was where we went wrong. Good question. Pardon?
Is that why you were murdered?
John Wilkes Booth was a Southern sympathizer. He didn't want to murder me. or didn't want to assassinate me. He wanted to kidnap me. He wanted to hold me for ransom so that the North would release the Southern prisoners that were up north. They could go down south and fight again. Well, once General Lee surrendered, they knew virtually the war was over. So what good would it be to kidnap me? It wouldn't. So he thought, well, I'm going to avenge the South. So I will be famous. He was more infamous than he was famous. The South, many in the South hated him. Even if you disagree with the president, you don't assassinate him. I wish he would have listened to them. Been easier on me. Yes, yes, sir.
Before you were elected president, did you have the idea to free the slaves then?
Before him being president, I have the idea to release the slaves. As a human, I mean, just as a politician or as a lawyer, whatever, it was definitely not in my power. Even as president, it wasn't in my power. Who passes the laws? Congress does. So it wasn't even in my country. And I said that if I can bring the Union back together by freeing all the slaves, I would. If I could bring the Union back together by freeing half of the slaves, I would. If I could bring the Union back together by freeing none of the slaves, I would do it. That was my job, was to bring the Union back together. And then we'll deal with slavery after that. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
What is the current
Casualties is probably over 1 million. Why are they finding more now? Well, most of the battles were in the South. A lot of the paperwork got burned when we went into the cities, or if we defeated the Southern on the battlefield, their camp may have been destroyed. A lot of the papers from their daily roll calls would be destroyed, so they wouldn't know who's who. And they had so many deserters at the end. You have any comment about it? Okay. They had so many deserters too, they didn't know who in the heck was what. So that's why now more things are coming out and they're realizing that there were more. Those are generations that aren't sitting in that seat or filling in these gaps. They're not here today because of that crazy Civil War. Good question. Yes, sir.
You know, there's some theories out there that the bankers were interested to get the United States into the Civil War so they could loan money to the government for the war. Is that true?
Oh, I'm sure it was. Talking about the banker. Who's a banker here first? I don't want to get shot again. Follow the money. Of course it was. All the banks were in the north. They knew that cotton was making them millions. They didn't want to disrupt any of that. Heck no. And they also knew that we needed, which I was for, we needed a national currency, a national transportation system, so that the small farmer, like my father in Indiana, could get his crops to market by the train, or a currency that's uniform among the whole country, so that, you know, if I sell it in a different state, that I wouldn't have to deal with their script or their railroad money or their bank money. It'd be all uniform. And of course the private banks and everything, they liked that idea, the private businessmen, because they wanted to be in charge of all that. I think we made them in charge anyway, didn't we? I think we did. Yes. Good questions. I love it. Yes, sir.
My grandsons are here. You had a unique education. The myth is you read by the fire.
Yes.
What would you tell the youth of today?
What I would say is, get off that dang thing that's in your hand. Whatever it is. What was fascinating to me was the new ideas, the new imaginations, future discoveries that I would read about, or that could be discovered by reading, by educating myself. Nowadays, of course, education is a little bit different, but back then it was books. And so I would be learning new ideas, new ways of doing things, the latest technologies and all that. So I was fascinated by all that. And I would hope that you would be fascinated, and you too, be fascinated by that and keep striving to educate yourself. You know, I mean, in the long run, you're going to remember all this knowledge in your head more than winning a game or something like that, right? So, good. Stay determined. Yes, sir.
Is it true that you and Jefferson Davis were born within a few miles of each other in Kentucky?
Who's Jefferson Davis? I'll know if he's a Southern or not by how he answers that. Who was Jefferson Davis?
President of the convention.
No, he wasn't. He was a fine gentleman from the South, but he wasn't president. This country's only got one president. Thank you very much. He was maybe of the rebellion, of the secession. But anyway, we were born about 100 miles from each other. Now, we had never met. I did not want to meet him. My vice president, or me myself, I would be in talks with their vice president, Alexander Stevens. I could discuss things with him. We met on the River Queen, my boat, my flatboat, on rivers many times to discuss what we were going to do about this war. But I wouldn't want to meet Jefferson Davis, because then that would be me recognizing the South, and I could not allow that to happen. So.
I know this video is long, but I wanted to get all of it I could on the Lincoln speech and questions. I ran out of SD card, then I ran out of batteries, so that's why we had to switch cameras.